Good morning. Good morning, everyone. We are so grateful that you've been able to join us today for this webinar, Sargassum Basics Part 1, hosted by the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association, as well as the Caribbean Alliance for Sustainable Tourism, CAS. Today, we will be talking about the latest research in terms of the outlook on sargassum that's affecting our Caribbean region. We'll also be going over some of the impacts and some of the strategies that we're going to be looking at, as well as innovations and different ways in which we can look at some of the implementation of action to help us manage and mitigate the sargassum that we are facing. We are joined today with three amazing panelists, Dr. Chuan Min Hu. He's the coordinator and of the satellite-based sargassum watch system from the University of South Florida. Thank you so much, Dr. Hu, for joining us. We also have Dr. Shelly-Ann Cox. She's the CEO of Blue Shell Productions, based in Barbados. And then we have the distinguished Mr. Jake Keel. He's the vice president of the Grupo Punta Cana Foundation. I know many of you know all of these wonderful speakers and panelists. And myself, I am Kay Dene Hines, CEO of Just a Tad Sustainability Consulting, based in Miami and Barbados, and originally from Bermuda. So without further ado, these are our panelists. Thank you all panelists for being with us. Our panelists are going to share their presentations, and then we will open it up for discussions shortly after. Just a few housekeeping tips. There is a Q&A box down to the bottom of the screen where you can log your questions throughout the presentation if you have any, okay? This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive, as a registered attendee, the presentations that will be shared in today's webinar. So you can make sure you'll have those once we conclude. And we also want you to make sure that you stay tuned next week and join and register for part 2 of this amazing Sargassum Basics series. We will be digging a little bit more deeper into communications and other ways in which we can harness this Sargassum seaweed to make it more of a positive versus more of a negative. So without further ado, I will get us started. And I'm going to welcome our first presentation from Dr. Hu. Dr. Hu, if you can please share your screen and walk our attendees through what you have in terms of monitoring sargassum.
Thank you. Now can you see, let's see. So do you see my presentation and hear me?
Yes, we can see your presentation and hear you wonderfully.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting. So today I'm gonna talk about how we monitor sargassum from space using satellites. I'm a professor at the University of South Florida. I work with many people who monitor sargassum to understand why sargassum occur in past years. So most of the research has been funded by NASA, NOAA, through SECURA and GCUS. So let's go directly to the field to see how we measure sargassum. So we use some technique to measure sargassum reflectance. So this is the reflected sunlight. Sargassum is a plant. It's on the ocean surface. It has a spectral shape. So we use the spectral shape to tell that is a sargassum, not lava or some other type of a floating algae. And we use the reflectance magnitude to tell how much. So we relate the shape and the magnitude to the floating matter type and to the sargassum amount to build a model to apply to a satellite. Then we have a lot of satellite images. We can do statistics. And here is how we do that. So this is a typical satellite image you see, I see. If you have data source, you see this every day. So what you see is to the east of the Yucatan Peninsula, you see cloud, you see blue ocean, but you don't see sargassum. I don't see sargassum either. But after I apply our model, we see this image. So there are a lot of image features, and each feature is associated with a spectral reflectance shape and magnitude. As I said, we can relate this to the plant type, that is sargassum, and also to the sargassum amount. You see a lot of data gaps due to clouds, but we can aggregate many images within a week to remove this cloud, to have this picture. So that tells you the amount of sargassum in each grid or each square in percent carbon. and we can convert this to Sargassum biomass. And then we integrate the data with the ocean circulation currents. So every arrow is a surface current vector. Then this forms a short-term forecast system. If you know the amount of sargassum and the location of sargassum, you know the current direction and the speed, you can forecast for the next few hours, next few days. So we have implemented this system to cover the entire Caribbean Sea, Gulf of Mexico, and West Africa. So this forms a Sargassum watch from space or source system. We use multiple satellites to provide daily, weekly updates online. Everybody has access, including NOAA. So actually NOAA pull out our data and in their web portal. So they combine with other data, with the statistics to produce Sargassum inundation probability report every week. So this is also open to the public. And next is just an animation of a weekly composite image to show how Sargassum in the Gulf of Mexico evolved in 1 month. So you can clearly see the transport from the Caribbean to the Gulf of Mexico. And we can also zoom into a certain region. For example, in this case, the EEZ of Gulf of Mexico, of Mexico. So on the top graph, you see how Sargassum amount evolved in the past years. And obviously, in each different region, you would experience a different amount of Sargassum. So on the bottom, it's the Straits of Florida. You see the temporal change, annual change is different. But we have this type of graph for every region. And to give you an idea of the general outlook, we produce a monthly Sargassum bulletin to show what is going on. This is the bulletin for March 2022. So what is going on in March 2022? So there's a huge amount of Sargassum in the Caribbean from east to the west. And then we compare with the previous March, 2021, 2020, and forecast what would happen in April, May, and even for in June. We do this every month. Then you may question, oh, that's good, but it's remote. I care about my beach. So what is going on my beach? So we do have some capacity to zoom in to look at individual beach. So in this case, we have a Miami Beach and the Cancun Beach. Now, with a small square, we can zoom in to look at how much Sargassum is in the shore, on the beach and around the beach. So the brown color, the dark brown is the Sargassum amount on the beach. The light brown is on the adjacent water for Miami Beach, for Cancun Beach. And we can pull out this data almost every day to look at how much Sargassum is accumulated on the beach for 2 months, 3 months, for a year. And in this case, and this is for 3 months or 5 months. In 2019, for Miami Beach, this is the Sargassum amount on the beach. This is for Cancun Beach. When we compare with the local government removal volume, they're pretty accurate. And also we can zoom into a local facility. And this is the recent image to show how Sargassum clogged the water intake of a water desalination plant in the US Virgin Islands. And because of this, there was a declaration of a state of emergency. So we have a lot of capacity, and we welcome people to use this capacity. And also we welcome people to ask the questions. So here's a short summary. So we have implemented this Sargassum watch system since 2016 with customized data products and maps from multiple sensors to serve the community. And we produce monthly bulletins to inform many communities. And we now have the capacity to zoom in to individual beach, but that's not implemented on the web yet. We can do research on this. With that, I stop and welcome your question in the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hu. That was very interesting, and it's good to understand and know that we have the ability to monitor this and look at this from a macro system as well as going into your own specific beach, which is definitely important. I am going to ask Shelly Ann if she can pull up her presentation so we can get started. We did have one question in terms of getting the citations. We'll make sure that we get that to you, Ms. Collado Videz. Thank you for your question. And now we're going to move on to Dr. Shelly Ann, who's going to tell us a bit more information about Sargassum and the information and the platforms that are used to get this information out to us. Thank you, Shelly. You may go ahead.
Thank you, Danae. It's really good to be here. A pleasant good morning and good afternoon to those joining us. Dr. Hugh gave a really good background and started to get into some of the negative impacts that we've been seeing from sargassum influxes since 2011. But this morning, I'm going to talk about some information resources that can help inform our decision making. And I'm going to end on a positive note, especially as we try to explore the opportunities that sargassum brings. And then, next week, we're going to look specifically at some of the sargassum solutions and highlight some of the brilliant innovators that we have in the region. So I wanted you to take a look at this photo. It really put perspective on the issue that we face in terms of sargassum influxes, but it also looked quite beautiful as well. So you've seen sargassum, described as, brown tide, influx, but, we are looking to shift mindsets and to view it as an opportunity, as a golden tide, a brown jewel. And, part of shifting this mindset, of course, takes time, it takes awareness, but, we have been collaborating as a network in Barbados, especially in the region and West Africa, to provide the information. And Dr. Hugh would have highlighted some of the work they're doing and his many collaborators. But I want to, if you could really see that it's a boat down there, so you see the extent of this map. And this photo was taken 2018 in Belize near Silk Keys, and that's the keys in the background of the photograph. So we have seen that negative impacts are multifactorial, and of course, tourism, fisheries, environment, coastal living, public health, maritime transport, energy, and most recently, the water resources sector. And, back in 2018, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, described sargassum as the greatest single threat to the Caribbean tourism industry. And we've seen huge impacts on tourism, but we've also seen a lot of negative international press. Recently, it's described as stinky seaweed, and sometimes that leads to a perception that the entire region is inundated with sargassum. But we know that some coasts on the windward side are exposed and maybe not our west coast. So we have to be careful about our messaging and how we engage with the media to share these stories. There are several reports of booking cancellations in the past, and in 2018, the cleanup cost was estimated at $120 million. When we look at fisheries, of course, a sector that supports tourism in terms of the provision of seafood, that sector is also significantly impacted, and we can see some of the impacts here. The environment, not only are our near shore, shallow water ecosystems affected, like mangrove, seagrass beds, and coral reefs, which is a big part of, dive tourism and the assets that people come to explore when they come to the region. But of course, our turtle nesting, which is becoming, an interesting excursion. We see that there are some challenges presenting for turtles who are coming up to, lay their eggs, and then the hatchlings when they're trying to make their way to the sea. Coastal living, which sometimes isn't highlighted, but of course, this also affects the hotels because of their proximity to the coast. they're unable to get relief from the poor air quality, due to the hydrogen sulfide and ammonia gases that are being released when sargassum is decomposing, and beach use is negatively impacted. Persons have also reported some corrosion of electrical appliances and equipment. And speaking about public health as well, there's some recent research looking at the exposure to these gases and how they affect pregnant ladies, for example. We'll talk a little bit about accessing those kinds of journal articles in the repository. But energy, which was something recent in Puerto Rico, they also experienced, the intake of their power facility being clogged with sargassum, and it resulted in a power outage. And then St. Croix, Dr. Hughes showed this earlier as well, there was a state of emergency, especially because, the intake was being blocked again by sargassum, affecting water production. So lots of impacts across different sectors, and, lots of management strategies being implemented, as well as, the provision of information. And we realize that, sometimes when we talk to stakeholders, they're not necessarily aware of the good information that's out there that can help inform their decision making. So there is the Sargassum Information Hub. There is also the Sargassum Net listserv and workspace, and a lot of other information resources. And I'll touch, just on each of them in one slide, being cognizant of time, but the hub is really the clearinghouse for information related to pelagic sargassum. And you can see here that you can also access, management related information in that tab. For instance, some country level management plans have been uploaded that you can consult for guidance, as well as management guides, policy briefs, and several other information resources that would be useful. We have the SARGNet listserv available on the Florida's University's webpage, and you can sign up here. The presentation will be available, so you can use the link. But there's also a Slack workspace. So on this Sargassum network, you get, notices of webinars, information in latest publications, persons asked to collaborate. It's quite a useful platform, as well as the spa, special areas, and wildlife. This would be coordinated by UNEPSET in Jamaica, and they also have an online forum. Dr. Hugh mentioned the USF monthly bulletin, and he also looked at this sargassum indentation report. But the French Caribbean islands would, through Meteo France, also have weekly bulletins available. And then the Sargassum Outlook, sub-regional outlook bulletin for the Eastern Caribbean, which CERMES produce, is bi-monthly, but available and uses the products from the SAWS program, but also includes some implications to sectors, as well as useful resources that can be consulted. Next issue is due next week on our next webinar on the 15th. So we will release and distribute the latest issue there. And here is the link to access those bulletins. Quite interesting tool is the Sargassum podcast, and doing very well because they're up to 52 episodes. And I will encourage those of you who have time to tune in and get more information. They featured, stakeholders, fishermen, innovators, researchers, scientists, lots of useful information available on that platform. And of course, webinars, workshops, symposia, conferences, like today, the virtual learning series, on the page, Sargassum Hub event. We frequently update this page so that you're aware of any upcoming webinars or in-person events that you can attend. So you can feel free to visit them. And then for those of you who are interested in lots of further reading in terms of scientific articles, but general resources. The CERMI Sargassum Reference Repository is constantly updated as information becomes available, and you can access it on the links here. So as I was telling you, this year, lots of useful information came out, not only about impacts, but new ways of accessing information, monitoring. Even Mexico, they would have produced an interesting study about, the timeline of Sargassum project in Mexico since 2011. And then really finally look into Sargassum as an opportunity. Here are, the most useful resources in terms of exploring uses. The Sargassum uses guide, for instance, looks at 14, so multiplicity of uses, some existing, some potential uses. And here you can see within the uses guide, there's a suggestion, which was, of course, due to guidance from the entrepreneurs of what 1 ton of fresh sargassum could be developed, and from fertilizers and shoes to building blocks to energy to activated carbon. So lots of opportunity for sargassum products, but also services as it relates to some of the new technologies in offshore harvesting, for instance, and on the beach. So, I want to encourage you next week to join us so that we can get a bit further and dive a little deeper in terms of the innovations and the opportunities and some of the challenges of turning sargassum into gold. I want to thank you so much for your attention, and here's my contact information if you want to connect.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shelly-Ann Cox. That was awesome. And as we have Jake pull up his presentation as he will be presenting next, there was one quick question that I wanted you to touch on, Shelly. There was a question in the chat regarding the sum of the cleanup costs. Was that for the entire Caribbean region in 2018?
Yes, that was reported by a tourism official. Let me just get the exact link and drop it there. Of course,
Perfect.
we know that is an underestimate.
Of course,
but yes, it is the only hard data we really have in terms of the types of impact. So, it'll be interesting if we can get, persons reporting from the hotel sector of their cleanup costs. Yes,
wonderful. And I do want to let everyone know that CHCA recently launched a survey looking at the Sargassum outlook and some of those preliminary numbers in terms of cleanup costs and additional costs that the Caribbean may have been experienced from those who answered the survey. Those will be out momentarily, so we'll have a better view on that. And without further ado, we'll have Jake wrap up with these presentations, looking at managing the threat and the outlook beyond for best practices. Jake, I yield the floor to you to present to us for the next 8 minutes.
Terrific. Thanks, everyone, and good morning. If you asked me 11 years ago what might have been the major threats to the tourism industry, major ecological threats might have been storms, maybe infectious diseases, degradation of coral reefs and how that impacts our beaches, might have been waste management, garbage. What do we do with garbage? But in no way would we have ever predicted that sargassum, seaweed arriving on the beaches, would be one of the greatest threats we face in the tourism industry. In the Dominican Republic, where we're based in Punta Cana, we've been severely impacted for the last 11 years. So now over a decade. And it's become more than just simply a problem. We're seeing every year more sargassum arriving. It's arriving to new parts of the island where it hadn't previously arrived. We're seeing greater quantities and impact on our beaches, both in the ways that we're managing the beaches and in areas where cleanup and management of sargassum is not possible, the impact on those coastal areas and coastal communities. So we are no longer talking about this as a threat or as a small problem or as an issue with some impact. We're talking about an emergency. We're talking about something that is a direct threat to the future of tourism in the Dominican Republic and in the rest of the Caribbean. And so if we want to think about some kind of future of tourism for the Caribbean which is built very much on beaches, on sun, on sand. This can't be part of our future. We need to get very serious about how we're managing Sargassum, because the impact is ecological. We're having impacts on water quality, on ecological systems and ecosystems, local species. We're having impact on economies. The impact of tourists that decide not to visit our region because of Sargassum, or that come and are disappointed, and it causes reputational damage because they report on what they saw or their experience because of Sargassum. We're having impacts on fisheries, a number of the things that Dr. Cox mentioned. So this is no longer just a small issue that happens part of the year. We're starting to see the Sargassum season in Mexico and other parts of the Caribbean is extending between 5 and 8 months of the year with at least some presence of Sargassum. So we really need to get serious about the response. And I would say from the tourism sector, if we look at it just purely from hotels and resorts, we have had to bear the brunt of the costs of this in a large measure. Our governments, local governments and national governments have not moved with the urgency that this problem requires. They have not moved with the resources that the problem requires. It hasn't been a coordinated effort, unfortunately, and really a huge part of the impact has been directly on the tourism area. And I think that this is important to remember, that the private sector in the tourism industry is not just hotels. The tourism industry cuts across all sectors of the economy. In our case, you're looking at banks, you're looking at insurance, you're looking at real estate, you're looking at construction industry. In the Dominican Republic, we're talking about agriculture, we're talking about excursion operators, food providers, restaurants. There's any number of industries that are directly and indirectly related to the tourism economy. And so when you have an impact like Sargassum, it's simply not feasible that only the hotels bear the cost of confronting this problem as it's been up to now. So I would say we really need to dive into a solution. We need to get into this with a lot more urgency, with a lot more seriousness, with a lot more coordinated effort. And it needs to be looked at not as a localized problem that's impacting just one island or one part of an island that's impacting just one tourism destination. This is a regional issue. And as we're starting to see, there's much better knowledge sharing from the academic side, much better knowledge sharing on the things we're learning that we can do with Sargassum. And I think now we really need to see regional coordination between governments and putting serious resources behind this problem. This is a photo from 2022, or 2021, I'm sorry. As you can see, one of the strategies we've deployed in Punta Cana is trying to confront Sargassum offshore before it arrives to the beach. And so we have used floating barriers as one of our strategies. These floating barriers come in a variety of types, of classes, of companies that are developing them. In this case, the white barriers you see were made by our company in our maintenance shop. They're highly effective. They use local materials that we can get pretty easily. And we've developed close to 4 kilometers of floating barriers that we devised on our own. However, it would be silly to say these couldn't be improved upon. I think if we had universities, if we had innovators, if we had inventors looking at the design we've got, they could be greatly improved upon. And so we're working with local universities in the Dominican Republic to try and take that on. There's also commercial providers of floating barriers. And we've seen great advances in that. We've from the early days, from about 2015, when we started using barriers, we've seen great improvement, and we think there's great room for improvement. And eventually there should be supply of these barriers locally in the region. Right now, most of them are imported from Europe and from other parts that are far away. So with supply chain issues, you're talking about 4 to 6 month delays. And so you're talking about decisions that need to be made with unproven technology on limited information. And we're deploying these basically with our learning as we go. I think we can do a much better job of coordinating these efforts, monitoring the impact, and seeing how barriers can be part of an integrated strategy throughout the region. And this is just to give you a sense of some of the impact that we've had in our area in terms of Sargassum. And also the effectiveness of the barriers. We found that the barriers in our particular case, essentially the seaweed hits the barriers and then the current continues along its way. And that means that it continues floating and it does not hit the coastline where it generally begins to cause serious problems, both for the use of the beaches, for the image of the hotel or the place, and also the local ecology. You start to have water quality issues, oxygen depletion, and fish kills, and any number of other issues, plus all of the costs of cleanup and management of sargassum once it hits the beach, and what that impact means for beach erosion. So we have been firmly committed to a strategy of taking this problem on offshore. We think it can be done much better, much more efficiently. And I think that's part of a strategy that needs to happen. Another piece of this management of sargassum has to be, once we have floating barriers or once we have some kind of retainment system for the sargassum, being able to collect it, both so it doesn't cause impact on the actual barriers by breaking the barriers or putting pressure on the barriers, but also as a function of being able to utilize the sargassum. I think the cost that we're incurring to manage and to do sargassum cleanup is so high that the only way we're going to come up with some kind of feasible management solution is if we have valorization of sargassum. If we turn it into something, if we transform it into something and it has an economic value, that might be able to help us subsidize some of the costs of protecting our beaches and eventually collecting the sargassum. So this is a system developed by a company that's based in the Dominican Republic, Algenova. This is their first model of a floating barge to collect sargassum. These are some of their early barriers that they deployed in our region. These are floating barriers. They've made a lot of advances in the way that they're deploying the barriers, the materials they're using to make them more durable, and the same with the collection systems. But we really have a long way to go to be able to retain the sargassum and collect it. This is another smaller scale effort by a group called SOS Carbon that's also working with us in the Dominican Republic. And they use small scale vessels to collect sargassum on local fishing boats and smaller vessels. One of the attractions here is that we can incorporate the local fishing community as part of a solution. Many of them have been impacted by sargassum in terms of their ability to fish. So if we're able to create new jobs and new opportunities where they're collecting sargassum as part of a strategy for managing it, then we have a much better chance of managing this problem as well. So we've been working closely with them. Again, this also has to be brought to scale. At this point, one boat with 2 net systems can collect approximately 100 to 120 cubic meters of sargassum a day. That is a tiny fraction of what is arriving to our coastline. So we need to have either an army of these boats, a much more efficient way of collecting it, or some kind of advance to really scale up this solution.
Thank you, Jake. I have a question that's coming in just as you're presenting. I think it would be great to answer it at this time.
Sure.
Regarding the barriers. How deep into the water column do those barriers reach? And do they impede any wildlife, such as nesting for sea turtles trying to reach the beach, or hatchlings heading to the ocean, to the open ocean?
Yeah. So the barriers, typically they have a netting that is anywhere from a foot and a half under the water. So it doesn't go all the way to the ocean floor. One, because that would be extremely expensive. It would be difficult to maintain, and also the impact on wildlife would just be unjustified. These are small barriers. The sargassum typically accumulates maybe a foot or so under the water. And in our specific case, the barriers are really a strategy of detaining the sargassum, but eventually our current is very consistently north to south. And so it generally wipes the sargassum off. The idea is not to have it build up on the barriers for a long period of time. So we haven't had any noticeable impact on turtle nestings. We've had turtle nestings throughout the sargassum. In fact, the biggest problems we had with sargassum and turtle nestings is when there's huge buildups on the beach and the turtles can't get in shore, or there's sargassum in the water and they get tangled up in it, and then you've had turtle drowning. So typically managing it offshore in deeper water is better for wildlife. It's been our experience. Again, this has been very much trial and error. So this could be something that this is definitely something that needs to be studied further. Our experience is very much in front of our resort. So the things that we've learned here may not work in every single island or every single situation, but we think there's a good knowledge base here that we can build on.
Excellent, excellent. And you mentioned earlier about sargassum now being a regional issue and how it's becoming such a cost issue for our region. Much like how people are declaring a state of emergency for climate change, do you think it's necessary for the region to kind of look along those lines to get more emergency management professionals and maybe budgets open up for sargassum relief if it was to be declared some form of a considerable emergency for the region? And then as a follow-up question to that, Shelly Ann, I know you were talking about communication and how we put out the message to what is the Caribbean doing and how sargassum is affecting us. How do we play that to make sure that we have the resources and people understand this is an emergency for some island destinations, not all? I want Jake to speak to should we declare it an emergency and what that may look like from a policy or potential financial resource perspective. And then Shelly, if you could follow up after that to just let us know around communication, what that looks like and how that, how we need to be mindful of that. If you could let us know that answer to that question, Jake and Shelly, and that would be awesome.
I think the functional reason of declaring it an emergency, at least from our experience in the Dominican Republic, is that allows greater access to resources and faster decision making that doesn't have to be passed through Congress and laws and regulations. So it allows more urgency. So I think in that sense, incredibly important at it.
Mm-hmm.
It's important that governments can act more agilely than they have been. They have to be able to take decisions. They have to be able to invest money. And if it has to go through a political process and go through reformulation into laws and, pass through Congress, Senate and get revised, years go by before anything happens. But the double-edged sword of that is you don't want to declare an emergency for sargassum and bring more attention to the region of having this problem. I mean, I think in our case, tourism is very sensitive to the way people perceive sargassum, whether their decision-making for where they're going to do their vacations. And so it's really important how we manage that information. I think, if it's possible to declare an emergency without making it a public declaration, is it more of a political function of being able to access resources? I think that's a better strategy.
Agreed. Dr. Cox, I would love to hear your thoughts on that since you did touch on communication. I'm not hearing you, Shelly.
Sorry about that. Yes, with all of these sensational news articles and headings in the last 3 weeks, because I have a Google alert on my phone. It was a bit disheartening to see, and especially some suggesting that the Caribbean was kind of inundated. We as researchers try to be the brokerage of information, and we try to update the clearinghouse that we have, but we realize that the media is not necessarily accessing that information. I've been speaking for a while about having some kind of workshop with media professionals in the region, as well as those who do marketing for tourism on a regional level, really to inform them of this, the linguistics of sargassum, because we have some terms like inundation, influxes, what these different things mean. But the fact that some of our windward coasts are exposed and not necessarily some of the west coast of the island, of course, where our beaches are still pretty clean. I mean, in Barbados this weekend, I have never seen sargassum like that on the West Coast. So there are some one-off events, and we're keeping abreast of the situation. But really, we need to have that direct channel to the media in terms of informing them of this. We're trying to do our best to have exposure and vulnerability information, so people have an idea of what the stranding locations are in the islands. But I will reference the conversation we had yesterday in preparing for next week with Leroy from Seabreeze, and he said that they included some messages in their welcome message to their guests, to inform them of the situation at hand. And I think that is a very, very good initiative. And I don't know, in terms of the hotels that are grouped that span different islands, if this is something that they can also do to try to inform everyone. We know there are influxes, but our beaches are still nice and pristine. Or we've seen some hoteliers, for instance, who are on the Windward Coast, shuttling people to the West Coast, for example, for day beach excursions. So we are seeing some initiatives, although they're not, actually, well, because you're in a certain network, you would hear about it, but I think we need to do a bit more to raise awareness.
I agree. And then there's also the opportunity of understanding that we need to diversify our offerings in general, right? I mean, sharing with guests that may come that, yes, there is sea, sun, sand, and beach, but there are other interesting opportunities for them to learn the island through culture, through tradition, through heritage tourism opportunities that may not always be coastside or seaside. So definitely making sure to include those types of excursions in the messaging and push those as well, although we know that there could be some concern there, but there is a lot to offer. Our Caribbean islands and big ocean states have much more than just that. So it's an opening for an opportunity to kind of diversify the offering somewhat in a bit. And if I may ask Dr. Hu a question, I know he's been answering some of these questions in the Q&A chat box, but for the general audience who may not have access to that, there was a question around whether or not there are times where sargassum is a problem that's going to be worse in other times. Why or why is that not? Dr. Hu, if you're still on, if you could just speak to us briefly around that and the monitoring of sargassum in general.
Sure. I actually answered that in the chat box. So depending on where you live, the problem, quote, problem, can be worse or better than other places, even in the major sargassum year. Even if there's a huge amount of sargassum in the Caribbean, but your beach may be totally clean. There's no problem at all. Or it could be much worse than the average situation. This depends on local wind and the tides, plus surface currents. So different beaches would have different experiences. Now, if we talk about individual years, certain years have way more sargassum than other years. That is mostly related to the major ocean circulation and the major wind, plus river runoff and dust deposition. There are major factors behind this. And that is currently under research. There's some discussion, debate, consensus, but there's no conclusion, okay? So we know some answer for local region, but for the interannual change for the entire region, and there's still under research.
Interesting. There's another question in the chat that's asking regarding the point of boom coming from Europe. They were wondering if there is a sort of international directory for sargassum solution providers. Jake or Dr. Shelley, would you have any understanding of solution providers for sargassum as an international directory?
We've seen, I think, maybe 7 or so types of barriers, and typically when we started this, using barriers in 2015 or so, we were using barriers that were normally designed for oil spills, so they're retainment booms, and then a lot of those have now been evolving into specific for sargassum. Oil containment booms don't work terribly well for sargassum, but the kind of evolution of those do. So there's a few companies doing it. I don't know that there's a directory. I only know of a handful of companies.
Our French colleagues did produce a manual for removal. They have listed the pros and cons of a few companies that provide these barriers. I had dropped the link under the Sargassum Management and Governance list of links, but I'll resend the particular one. But since then, of course, I believe they're working on an updated version because this was released, I believe, in 2020. So there are, new companies offering these services.
Great. Dr. Hu, this question is for you. How far in advance or how far ahead can we predict the model for sargassum influx into the region? I know you guys monitor it monthly, but how far of a forecast are we able to get through the work that you're doing with the SWOT?
We cannot predict sargassum inundation on an individual beach. Nobody can do that at this time. Or even NOAA, they use the statistics to give you a probability of a beach inundation.
Mhm.
Okay, but talking about a large area. So
Mhm.
let's see. Currently, we have this much. We know that from satellites. What would happen next month, 2 months later for the entire Caribbean or the Eastern Caribbean? We can do that up to 2 or 3 months, at most 3 months. But after 2 or 3 months, I don't think anybody can predict. The reason is the mechanisms behind how sargassum evolves in time in a large region are not fully understood.
Understood.
If I could just
Jake.
add, I think one of the values of monitoring and projecting, for us, honestly, like we have our barriers are basically going to be in the water either throughout the year or at least when there's sargassum in the region. And the collection is very difficult to track based on the modeling that we see. I think one of the great values of monitoring and determining who's going to receive sargassum in a big picture is to really motivate governments to act, because what Dr. Cox is saying, they're shuttling people from one beach to another. In some places they're, focusing hotels in certain parts of the area, but the sargassum, the amounts that we're seeing every year is greater, and the areas, at least in the Dominican Republic, that are being touched by sargassum increase every year. It's not less beaches or less coastlines that are being impacted, it's more. And so if you fast forward 5 to 10 years, where are we going to be seeing sargassum? We need a strategy for that now. We're behind the ball on where sargassum is arriving today. We're really far behind the ball on where it's going to be in the future. So if we really want to think about having a viable coastal tourism economy, we need to get ahead of where the sargassum is going to be. And I think that modeling, we were kind of joking on the call, but Dr. Hu is, can we figure out kind of a projection map to see where is going to get impacted by sargassum in the future, and be able to show, okay, like the north coast of this island, the east coast, which doesn't currently have it, or the windward side doesn't currently have it, who's going to get it in the next few years?
Talking about that, you have a great point, Jake. So we already have some statistics based on the past 20 years to show where are the sargassum hotspots in the Caribbean. But that's a statistics. That doesn't mean you will certainly get this much next year. It's 70% you will get this much. So it's a statistic-based hotspot map. We do have this.
And there's another question regarding the monitoring. Has high frequency radar been used anywhere to assess imminent invasion, to detect or assess imminent invasion?
Yes, a group at the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, they were experimenting with the synthetic aperture radar, but they Green from CIMH, he had actually presented at the International Conference for Sargassum, but they have not really pursued it any further. I can check in with them to see if there are any updates. But of course, in terms of being able to see through the clouds was advantageous, but that work has been put on pause, unfortunately.
Well, synthetic aperture radar is available from satellites. On top of that, there are local groups, including the Regional Association funded by NOAA, the Caribbean Coastal Ocean Observing System. I think they have deployed HF radar to monitor local surface currents. So once they know the sargassum location, they have a very precise, accurate surface current to have a local prediction. I think that's one way to go for a local monitoring system.
And do we have an alert mechanism for the Caribbean for sargassum?
I'm sorry, can you repeat?
Do we have an alert mechanism for the Caribbean islands in terms of sargassum influx?
Well, my group has been producing the monthly sargassum outlook bulletins. Every month we send out this bulletin. Yes, and the NOAA has pulled out the information from different sources to have an sargassum inundation probability map. They update the map every week. So all those are public information.
Wonderful.
And
let's
then we have the
change to-
sub-regional. Oh, sorry. I
Right.
said then we have their sub-regional sargassum outlook bulletin, and we're in the process of trying to, work with other colleagues to provide it for the Northern Caribbean as well. But we produce bi-monthly, so every 2 months.
And those bulletins are shared through CHCA on the website and through our general information out. Let's change the tide just a bit. I know we have about 8 more minutes, and I'm going to get a little bit into shifting the mindset of sargassum as something not so much of a negative, but as a positive. We will speak next week on some of the impacts and innovations of sargassum, but I just wanted to touch on it quickly around the idea of sargassum being a carbon sequestration mechanism and what that looks like, or looking at sargassum and the opportunities for use for innovation. If any of our panelists can speak to that just quickly in about 2 minutes each, because we are coming up on time, I think it would be great to end on a positive note to get some of our attendees thinking about the next steps after they employ these to monitor and collect what can be expected for potential opportunities. I'd like to start. I know, Jake, you have some, and follow up with Shelley and conclude with Dr. Hu.
Yeah, I would just say, I think making something valuable out of sargassum is going to be the key to being able to manage it in the region. If we don't have something of value out of sargassum, it's just going to be a black hole of money going into cleanup and management and moving sargassum around. So we need to have some income to take that on. I think the scale of the problem is industrial, and I think the response and investment in these products and transforming sargassum has been artisanal, and I think that needs to change. We need more R&D, we need more money, we need more effective coordination to really determine what are the uses and bring it to scale. Even that slide, that beautiful slide Dr. Cox had of, what can 1 ton of sargassum be turned into? At the moment, we're dealing with hundreds of tons of sargassum. We're dealing in the region, thousands of tons of sargassum. How are we going to bring to scale these solutions? We've been trying to push it from the private sector, from the tourism industry, from the hotel sector. I think we really need to see governments creating the conditions where innovators, where entrepreneurs, where investors can really put significant resources into turning sargassum into something. So I think there's a great opportunity there. I think there's a big future to do it, but I think we really need to see more resources, and we need to see it with greater urgency.
Well said, Jake. And just to add here that, there's been lots of discussion around the potential of sargassum in terms of its carbon sequestration capacity. And I'm going to hand over to Dr. Hu because I know he has done some work on this. And of course, as with other uses, sargassum may not be the best at carbon sequestration when compared to, say, mangrove seagrass beds. But a lot of work would have to be done at a regional level to look into a regulatory framework for the trade of blue carbon credits. For example, we see, Apple and some larger cruise lines getting into blue carbon credits, and the tide is definitely changing. So it's something we definitely need to keep tabs on, but I know a lot of policy development would have to be done in order to support this particular innovation. But Dr. Hu, over to you.
Yeah, I just want to mention the potential of carbon sequestration by sargassum. So you have, I agree, a wonderful slide to show how much carbon is there in 1 ton of sargassum. So about 10% of sargassum wet biomass is carbon. And plus, sargassum does photosynthesis to synthesize carbon dioxide into organic form, organic carbon. Some of this carbon would sink to the ocean bottom to remove carbon dioxide from the air, and others would be recycled. Now, if we can tie some industry The industry has some, I think, carbon emission quota. Okay, so if they can collect the sargassum and bury sargassum or remove carbon, okay, from the ocean, then they can compensate or they can ask for more carbon emission quota. That's a dollar value. So the question is, how much? How much sargassum they need to remove in order to increase this much quota for carbon emissions. So that there's a market there. And if the industry is interested in buying into this, then there will be a big solution to this big problem.
Exactly. And to follow on to what all of the panelists have said in regards to that positive use, it needs to be looked at as a financial opportunity. And as Jake said, if we cannot find a positive solution out of this, then it will be all just spending money for no reason. So I would like to thank wholeheartedly from the bottom of my heart our panelists for just sharing their views, their expertise, and their information today. It has been lovely chatting with all of you. We are coming up on time. We have 2 more minutes. I would also like to let everyone who has joined us know that we are recording this session and will be available for you, as well as each presenter's presentation. We also ask that if you have specific questions, all of the information of how to contact our panelists will be on their slides. And if you have direct questions for us at CHTA or CAST, you can feel free to send us a note. And also we encourage you to register for part 2 of our Sargassum Basics. We will be following up with a lot more, digging deeper into the innovations behind Sargassum and what we're seeing there, some more best management and practices and strategies from hoteliers and tour operators, as well as looking to understand what are some of the positive ways we can communicate about Sargassum to our guests who will be visiting our shores. Understanding that Sargassum is a problem that we have been dealing with for a while. Not every island is dealing with it, but we do appreciate the fact that many of you have tuned into this session. We know it is a hot topic. We would like to say thank you for your time. We hope you have learned something valuable here and that you will definitely continue to reach out to us, CAST and CHTA, for your resources for everything in the Caribbean tourism region, but specifically on this issue of Sargassum. So thank you again, Dr. Hu, Dr. Cox, Jake Keel. It has been a pleasure. I am Kajane Hines. I have moderated this session with you. I wish you all a wonderful week, and we'll see you next week as we continue this wonderful discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank
It's a pleasure
you.
to participate.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.